With this closing unit, we enter into the present era, and with that comes all the challenges of an historian in their own time. John W. Gardner, who is the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare under President Johnson, once said that history never looks like history when you're living through it. So what we'll try to do here is take a long view, try to step back and get as close to the perspective of a future historian as we're able to do. We won't succeed, of course, but we'll try to get close. And it's possible that future historians will see this era with greater clarity and precision of the sort that perspective allows. It's also possible that the clarity of the historical perspective will only render the incoherence of America's militarization during this era into sharper focus. What's certain is that from the vantage of the present, incoherence really predominates. So let's look here at our standard opening slide of, the vital statistics of the era. Centcom, or the United States Central Command, was created in 1983. What you see pictured here is a map showing the geographical reach, the AOR, or areas of responsibility, of each map-bound command. There are others that are not map-bound. We'll look at a couple of those. The geographical region encompassed by Centcom, rendered here in yellow, mostly the Middle East, was militarily speaking, from the perspective of America, a total backwater until the 1970s. It was not on the map of importance for American military purposes. Part of what we'll cover today is how this command came into ascendancy, how it became the central focus of America's military-industrial complex. So why begin this era of warfare in 1980, as you see here, rather than with Centcom's creation in 1983? And the short answer is that 1980 was the introduction of the Carter Doctrine, which has been extended, especially with the Bush Doctrine, and which continues to drive American military engagement today. We'll get to that. But first, the reason. Why do we fight? What's the cause? To defeat Islamism is one governing answer, and we just want to take a minute to note what that means, Islamism, right? So Islam is a noun. It refers to a religion. Muslim is an adjective referring to something religious, a Muslim person, Muslim text, Muslim faith. Islamic is an adjective that describes something cultural but not necessarily religious, like, for instance, Islamic architecture. Now, Islamism is a noun. It's kind of a meta-noun, and it refers not to the religion of Islam, but to a socio-political movement growing out of Islam's contentious relationship with the modern and modernizing world. And we'll come back to that. So that's one reason. Or, to defeat terrorism, the use of asymmetric military acts to meet political ends. And that's something that we'll also come back to. Another reason is oil. The Carter Doctrine stated, in brief, that the free flow of oil from the Middle East is a matter of American national security, and therefore a matter the preservation of which may require American military engagement, which it certainly has. So that's definitely another reason. Or empire. Military historian Andrew Bacevich, and we'll take just a second here to note that in many ways the lectures for this unit, I really lean on the work of Andrew Bacevich, who's done a great deal. Each of these books I've read, he's written many others, but I can recommend these to you. The middle on the bottom is an edited version, all the others are authored. And he may not agree with every frame I give to the material, every interpretation, but I certainly do depend on his work for my understanding, and because we won't have time to deal with the military specificities of the era in the way that we might like to, I do recommend these books to you, any of them, if you're interested in it. But okay, back to empire. Bacevich writes, allow for the possibility that American purposes do not differ greatly from those of the British, French, or German in the heyday of American colonialism, and the moral basis of exercising global leadership begins to look shaky. So allowing for that possibility, empire goes on the list. Or power projection. It's different from empire in that it's not committed to keeping a kind of colonial-style cultural rule over the regions within which it wars. And this is the reason why historian Niall Ferguson sees the U.S. as a mostly failed empire, one that's abdicated its duties. His own reading is a little contentious. It's arguable. It's not wrong. We might not like the conclusions he comes to, but he certainly comes to them in good faith and with a great deal of substance. So that's certainly a possibility. And we'd be remiss not to note that it also could be, and sometimes certainly is, for the money. All to say, unlike defeating communism or fascism, and we could go back, this casus belli, this reason for war, it lacks coherence. So where to begin? And I've dated the start from the introduction of the Carter Doctrine, but trying to get our finger on the pulse of, the American myth means going back just a little further. The Carter Doctrine was first publicly articulated at the State of the Union, January 23rd, 1980. But two things happened in 1979 that maybe didn't themselves get the ball rolling, but that each provide us with a snapshot of the early roll, if nothing else, the early momentum. First, Carter's Crisis of Confidence speech, which you read, officially titled Energy and the National Goals, delivered July 15th, 1979. Now, at this time, gas was too expensive, plastic was more expensive. Americans were feeling a deep sense of urgency when what they had come to think of as basic needs were no longer being easily met. So Carter goes to Camp David, named incidentally after Eisenhower's son, David. And like Moses up the mountain, he seeks the truth. He talks to Americans from every walk of life, and he comes to the conclusion that the fundamental threat to American democracy was a crisis of confidence, a crisis of the American spirit, profound and widespread doubts about the meanings of our lives, the loss of a national sense of purpose, the loss of faith in the citizen's role as a shaper of democracy, of the national sense of meaning, value, and purpose. This is a moral and a spiritual crisis for Carter. American exceptionalism, American optimism was foundering on the rocks of doubt and fear. And for the first time, Carter tells us, Americans didn't believe that the days of their children would be better than their own. The fundamental threat to American democracy, as Carter sees it, is a crisis in our myth. From today's vantage, where 1979 is sort of ancient history, I have a cool quote for you on this one. American historian and philosopher Will Durant once said, "Most of us spend too much time on the last 24 hours and not nearly enough time on the last 6,000 years." Right, so for us, 1979, ancient history, way far away past, and from our current perspective, we can look back on that and we can see some problems with this speech. I'm sure you see others. Here's a few I see. First, the speech gilds the past. It sees it as more just, more equitable, more peaceful than in fact it was, as we've seen. Also, he tells us that until recently, we were sure as a nation that we were a nation of the ballot and not the bullet. And then he laments the violent deaths, the murders of John and Bobby Kennedy and of Martin Luther King Jr. But even as he lifts Malcolm X's phrase, the ballot or the bullet, he doesn't mention his name. He had also been murdered. So... And another one, also, the shale oil that Carter celebrates as a way to gain energy independence for Americans, right? You get that by fracking. And Carter at the time, he didn't see a world where tap water could be flammable, where Oklahoma could have more earthquakes than California due to fracking, right? So he didn't see that. So the speech has problems, and we can critique it, but that's not really our purpose here. In addition to its problems, the speech does contain a great deal of insight. And Carter says we have two paths to choose from. The first is fragmentation and self-interest. The second is common purpose and true freedom. He tells America, there are no short-term solutions to our long-range problems. There is simply no way to avoid sacrifice. I do not promise you, he says, that this struggle for freedom will be easy. He asks America to give up a little bit in the interest of securing true freedom. He asks America to recognize that freedom, in its mythic sense, as the motivation for the American experiment and as the justification for American exceptionalism, that freedom wasn't tied to material comfort, and it wasn't commensurate with energy dependence. Remember that Carter's presidency followed pretty directly on an enormous collapse in American morale and confidence, and he knows this. And he really does try at this moment to bring the American mythos of peace, freedom, universal human rights, all of that, to bring that mythos into a greater alignment with American actions at home and abroad. The speech resonated with Americans. They liked it. It inspired, they were inspired by the kind of freedom that he encouraged, a kind of freedom that Bacevich tells us was qualitative. It meant living in accordance with permanent values. And Americans resonated with that, the notion that the nation itself should be connected to a set of permanent values that were good and just and true. It was inspiring, and America was inspired. Carter's approval rating jumped 10 points. But then, the high wore off, and Americans thought about it, and sacrifice didn't sound so great. America said no. So that was the first thing. Also in 1979, a man named Paul Wolfowitz wrote the Limited Contingency Study. Now, Paul Wolfowitz, whose name most of you probably recognize, he would become the intellectual force behind the neoconservative movement, the neocons. He would also become the president of the World Bank and the deputy secretary of defense under George W. Bush. He is, at this point, 36 years old. He's young. He's just gotten his first job at the Pentagon. But he sees something early, something that nobody else really saw. It's the 70s. Everybody's studying Russian. It's the middle of the Cold War, so of course, Russian is what you study. Wolfowitz studies Arabic. He saw that America needed the Persian Gulf, and he saw that it would be complicated. From the limited contingency study of this 1979, this year, he lists some of the problems. Here's what he lists. Some of the problems that America would encounter in the Persian Gulf region. Ideological rivalries, territorial disputes, the clash between modernizing trends and the forces of tradition, ancient ethnic and religious hatreds, and sheer personal ambition fed by the enormous wealth that is at the disposal of some very weak governments. He saw what plenty continued not to see or care about decades later. And about a lot of it, he turned out to be right. The Soviets fell and they left a huge power vacuum. We hoped, America, the so-called First World, we hoped for peace and democracy and all of that, butterflies and unicorns, after the Soviet Union and communism fell, right? After that great arch rival that we had figured is the epitome of evil, after that was conquered, we pictured a kind of, democratic utopia, but that's not what happened. Small powers emerged. At the center of power, it turns out, is the long fractured region that happened to sit on a large chunk of what happened to be a resource central to the American way of life, oil. And of course, there was also the heroin. It was a good place to play the diplomatic game, so everyone throws in their hooks. Middle Eastern nations whose borders had already been drawn, some of them straight as a city planner's grid, by colonial powers, drawn with, none of them drawn with any real serious consideration of cultural identity or difference. These were drawn when the Ottoman Empire fell with all of the other Central Powers in World War I. Those nations were seen as easy pickings for large imperial states, so Wolfowitz was the guy who saw it coming. And as early as 1979, he saw that Iraq would be the central threat, second only to the Soviets in the region. He was young, it was a study, it might not have gone far. Pentagon puts out really a lot of studies. But his mentor, Albert Wolstetter, who was an influential defense strategist with the Rand Corporation, published an op-ed in agreement with Wolfowitz, saying, quote, "Like it or not, the fate of America and its major allies is tied to OPEC," which stands for the oil-producing and exporting countries. So in 1979, in addition to the Iranian Revolution, which destabilized the region, we have Carter's crisis of confidence speech and Wolfowitz's limited contingency study. And both saw what Wolstetter saw, that the fate of America was somehow tied to OPEC. The question that Carter posed for Americans was, how? How would it be tied? How would you like it to be tied or related to this region, right? What kind of nation are we? What to us is freedom? What are we willing to sacrifice for freedom? These were Carter's questions. The answer that Americans gave pretty resoundingly was not much, really not willing to sacrifice much. The Cold War fear of being destroyed, like actually completely obliterated and destroyed, transitioned to a fear of, maybe having to change our lifestyles, which were rooted in consumerism. The American people decided that our comfort is more important than our ideals. And so we come to the Carter Doctrine. The somewhat date-specific beginning that I've given to this era of American military involvement, again, it's January 23rd, 1980, in the State of the Union, when Carter says, "Let our position be absolutely clear. An attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States of America, and as such, an assault will be repelled by any means necessary, including military force." This is the Carter Doctrine. This is the beginning of the war that never ends. The Soviets also wanted in the 80s, which allowed Cold War commitments to form something of a bridge here. We will protect anyone from international communism. And remember the Eisenhower Doctrine, right? That was regionally specific to the Middle East, and it provided for and promised military aid. In the 80s, the threat of international communism was still very real. The Soviet Union had not yet fallen. And they were in Afghanistan, as you can see from the map. It was close, and there's a reason they were angling for that region. So we went to Afghanistan to, protect the Afghanis. At this point, the Eisenhower and Carter doctrines are overlapping justifications. When communism falls apart, when the Soviet Union falls, we lean far more exclusively on the Carter Doctrine. The free flow of oil from the Middle East is a matter of American national security. In 1982, President Reagan adds Afghanistan Day to the national calendar in an official proclamation in support of, quote, "the freedom fighters who were defending principles of independence and freedom that form the basis of global security and stability." That's Reagan talking about the Mujahideen, whom he entertains in 1983 in the Oval Office. 1988's Rambo 3, a blockbuster hit, was dedicated, quote, "to the gallant people of Afghanistan." America was on the side of Afghanistan through the 80s, so long as the Soviets were against Afghanistan. Neither superpower cared much about what the religious traditionalists in Afghanistan wanted, what they thought about things. That really wasn't the point. The point for America was to keep the Soviets out of the region and to ensure the free flow of oil to the United States and its allies, not necessarily in that order. What had been the Rapid Development Joint Task Force, or the RDJTF, a far more bureaucratic than practical reality, became Centcom in 1983. Now, the establishment of a U.S. military command signals commitment. It means that we're sticking around in the region for a while, not leaving anytime soon. You can see AFRICOM here in green. That wasn't actually established until 2007. Now, we could say a lot of things about Paul Wolfowitz, anyone could, but remember that in 1979, he articulated a series of what he saw as problems in the region. At no point in the establishment of this command, CENTCOM, did the U.S. seek to learn about the culture, history, religion, worldview, or mythos of the people in this region. It just wasn't something, it was an enormous blind spot for military engagement. At no point did the U.S. make an effort to learn about its internal conflicts or disagreements, about its notions of freedom or security, about its moral horizons. This was a secular command with a secular mandate in a region where secularism was very much not the norm. So the Soviets leave Afghanistan in 1989, and then the U.S. leaves. There's no oil in Afghanistan. Afghanistan has a civil war when the Soviet-installed regime collapses and the Taliban gain control. By the mid-1980s, combating terrorism has become the official mandate for a number of reasons we don't really have time for, and the Pentagon was tasked with figuring out how. How do you combat terrorism? It turns out that preventive war was the method, though we don't openly call it that until President Bush Jr. and the Bush Doctrine. Now, again, we don't have time here to cover anywhere near the full story of the Gulf Wars. I'll highlight a couple things for the sake of fact, but again, I recommend to you the books of Basevich or others if you're looking to learn more about it. What America needed for the free flow of oil was regional stability. Iran and Iraq had long vied for regional supremacy, regional primacy. Now, Iran was Persian, Iraq was Arab. Iran is Shia, Iraq is Sunni. Iran is run by Islamic revolutionaries. Iraq is run by secular Baathists, right? The two nations did not see eye to eye, except in that they both deeply resented American involvement in the region. The first Gulf War of 1980 to 1988 was a mess. Now, in the middle of it fell the Iran-Contra affair, when United States Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North went on national TV and took the fall. He was clearly guilty, he just wasn't the only one, but he took the fall for immensely immoral state actions. The U.S. supported Saddam's Iraq while also secretly funneling weapons to Iran through the middleman that was Israel, and giving the proceeds to the anti-communist Nicaraguan Contras to fight the Sandinistas, who also used the arrangement to get cover to smuggle cocaine into the U.S. To help fund that war. All of this was known by Oliver North and others. Oliver North, incidentally, becomes the president of the National Rifle Association for about a year in 2018. The Iran-Contra affair was a massive scandal, and it was a real low point in American engagement. It's not necessarily representative of what goes on. It was scandalous, but it's also illustrative of the objective, which was militarization, a preponderance of force, and an attempt to control governments around the world. Right? We are now in both Latin America and the Persian Gulf region in the same operation, funding wars on every side through arms, not governance. And that's the root of Niall Ferguson's critique of American empire, as he calls it, is that we don't, as a nation, do what previous empires have done, and for better and clearly for worse, establish regional governments. Mostly we just funnel arms and the money. In the era of the new American militarization, which began in the 80s, everything spins around oil. It's necessary to preserve the American life, and therefore it is a prerequisite to American conceptions of freedom. Now, it's too simple to say that the last 40 years of American war in the Middle East has been about oil. It's been about other things too. It's most certainly been about oil, but not exclusively. Leading up to the Second Gulf War of 1991, Iraq invades Kuwait, a very small, oil-rich nation, and Saddam is now unambiguously America's enemy. Remember, he had been America's ally. Now he's the enemy. And President George Bush Sr. says famously, "This will not stand. This aggression against Kuwait will not stand." So the Second Gulf War lasts just over a month, from mid-January to late February of 1991. It was short. America was happy. Kuwait was quote-unquote liberated. Time magazine said it was, quote, "the end of the old American depression called the Vietnam Syndrome, the compulsion to look for downsides and dooms." And maybe it was, but it wasn't a clean end. Saddam's Republican guards were left to regroup and rebuild, so they did just that. The U.S. pulled out and left behind what Bacevich calls an epic humanitarian disaster. The conditions that were left behind were conditions ripe for future violence. That's just what they were. But for the military strategists, for the Pentagon masterminds, that's just kind of the way it had to be, right? Saddam had to still be standing to be that counterweight to Iran. Iraq had always been supported by the U.S. as a way to ensure that Iran didn't get regional primacy. Remember that what America wants is enough regional stability to keep the oil freely flowing. So a couple effects of the Second Gulf War, also known as Operation Desert Storm, other than planting the seeds for violence in the future in the region, is that, number one, America starts building bases all over the region, including Saudi Arabia, the Muslim Holy Land. The holiest cities are located there. They'd eventually come, as you see here, this is a later map, but they would eventually come to basically circle Iran. This is what the military bases were set up to do. There were some Saudis who didn't appreciate an influx of what looked more and more like permanently positioned armed infidels in the Muslim Holy Land. And there were plenty who focused less on the religious insult and more on the very colonialist-looking military occupation. One of the many Saudis who was upset about this, on religious as well as political grounds, was a young man just back from fighting in Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden. We will see him later. Now, Saudi authorities quieted him. He was a bit of an outcast to begin with, although his position, his perspective, wasn't as marginal within the Muslim community of the region as we might like to wish it were. He fled to the desert to build up an army of mujahideen, or holy warriors. Okay, so that was one thing, one effect. Second effect is that, Time magazine was right about home front morale. America loved its troops again. Remember, up until this point, we were still on the tail end of Vietnam, where the military wasn't celebrated. Troops weren't. There were no parades, right? This was it was not a time when America celebrated its central institutions of militarization. Well, with Operation Desert Storm, also known as the Second Gulf War, the troops were back in America's good graces. The more so because Americans in general were not counted in their numbers. Americans didn't want to fight. They didn't want to sacrifice. But so long as their way of life was protected, they would applaud the troops. We will come back to that. So just to wrap it up for now, the dissolution of the Soviet Union was a chance for America to rethink militarization. But by the time the Soviet Union fell in 1991, the Carter Doctrine had already embroiled the U.S. in a new normal. What becomes clear looking over American life since the Carter Doctrine is that there are no military solutions to the problems America now faces in the greater Middle East, or to the problems on the home front that have, in large part, led us there. Problems of, conflating freedom with consumption, problems of the American way of life not necessarily matching the articulated American myth, the ideals that we espouse. Militarism is a worldview that sees always a military solution, and America is, at this point, militarist, at home and abroad. But there just aren't any military solutions to our problems now. In a book called War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, journalist Chris Hedges writes this, quote, "Lurking beneath the surface of every society, including ours, is the passionate yearning for a nationalist cause that exalts us, the kind that war alone is able to deliver. It reduces and at times erases the anxiety of individual consciousness." He may be right, it may be true, it may be human nature to desire the stakes, the high moral drama, the risk for something bigger, the exaltation of war. It may be worth it to reduce and erase individual anxiety. It may be worth it for any number of causes. To bring honor, courage, and commitment to a cause that's bigger than oneself, that exalts a person. To risk one's life in defense of something true and good, that exalts a person. To sincerely say, and with true and authentic risk, "Give me liberty" or "Give me death," that exalts a person. But hypocrisy doesn't. Disingenuousness has no place in war rooms, or in recruitment offices, or in rituals of public patriotism and national piety. There's no exaltation in duplicitous engagement, no exaltation in the violent defense of a freedom enjoyed only by the few and itself reduced to mercantile licentiousness, diminished to a freedom to consume. And hypocrisy, disingenuousness, duplicity is present where myth and behavior don't align. We'll continue next, moving on through the story of American militarization into now the 21st century.